In this video, I will show you 4 different sewing methods that you can use to seam your crochet projects together. I will also go over the pros and cons of each one to help you decide which one works best for you and your particular crochet project. I am using granny squares as my example pieces to sew together. However, these methods will also work for other crochet projects that require seaming, such as sewing together panels for a bag or sewing a sleeve onto a sweater. So let's get started. The first stitch I'm going to show you how to make is probably the easiest one to learn, and that's the whip stitch. Now I'm going to be using a contrasting color of yarn as I work so you can see the stitches. I'm going to start on the left side and work over to the right. However, you can start on whichever side you prefer. So beginning in my bottom corner, which is going to represent my first stitch, I'm inserting my needle from back to front, and I'm going to continue to pull and leaving a small tail. Now I'm going to work on the other side in that same space, this time inserting my needle from front to back. I'm not going to pull my yarn super tight quite yet, and I'm going to pick up both of my pieces here so that I can work. The next stitch that I'm going to be working into is this double crochet stitch, this very first one here, going underneath both loops once again, from back to front, and then going over to the other side, that very first double crochet, I'm going to be working from front to back. Next stitch here, back to front, next double crochet, going underneath both of those loops, front to back. So you can see that we're starting to create a spiral motion. So if you think of this stitch, you might want to think of a spiral notebook. And as you sew, you might find it better to fold your pieces together like this to sew, or you can hold them in whatever way you feel more comfortable with. I'm going to do one more here, and then I'm going to continue to work off camera. I'm going to go back to front and front to back. And once again, it doesn't really matter what side you start in as long as you're making that continuous spiral motion. So I'm going to continue to work off camera, and I'm going to show you what this stitch looks like when I get to the top. When I get to the end, I'm just going to pull on my ends to tighten up that seam a bit. If you're working on a really large piece, you may want to do a few stitches and then tighten them up as you work. Just be careful to not pull your seam too tight to where your stitches scrunch up. So when we're talking about the pros and cons of each of these stitches, a couple of things that I really like about the whip stitch is that it's pretty easy to use. It also leaves a fairly sturdy seam because you're working underneath both of those loops. Some things that you may not enjoy about it is it's obviously a very visible seam. You can see right here, but it is kind of a nice spiral. So if you're working with this stitch, you might want to be using 2 pieces that are the same color and using yarn that is the same color as well. However, it's a pretty nice basic stitch. For the next stitch, I'm just going to sew another granny square onto the side, and that way when I finish with all the stitches, you can kind of see a side-by-side comparison. The next stitch I'm going to show you is also the whip stitch, but this time we're going to only be working in the back loops. So when you're looking at your crochet stitches, you're going to notice that you have these V's. So when I say I'm going to be working in the back loops, that means I'm only going to be inserting my needle on this back side of each of these V's. So I'm either going to be working from back to front, or I'm going to be working from front to back, splitting those V's in half. Once again, starting on my left side, I'm going to find my very first chain stitch, which is right here, and I'm going to insert my needle from back to front on this side. We're going to do the same motion that we did for the whip stitch, which is just kind of a spiral or spiral notebook kind of motion. Then I'm going to go on my other side here, and I'm going to insert my needle from front to back on this side. Okay, and now once again working in my next stitch, back to front, and on this side, front to back. Once again, you might find it more easy to fold your pieces in half so that it's easier to see the seam. It's whatever method works best for you. Once again, going in from back to front in the back loop only. And on the other side, front to back, back loop only. I'm going to do a couple more just so that you can see here. Back to front on the front loop only, and front to back on the back loop only. So I'm going to continue off camera working in this spiral stitch until I get to the top, and I'll show you what that seam looks like. And then once again, just tightening up my seam by pulling the ends. And here is what that seam looks like when I've gotten to the top. And you can kind of see it side by side in comparison to the whip stitch where we worked underneath both loops. So a couple of things that I like about this is, once again, it's fairly easy to do, just working into those back loops, and it does leave kind of a different look on the front than the whip stitch where we work underneath both of those loops. It's kind of less noticeable. However, you can still see your yarn that you use to sew, so I would recommend using the same color of yarn. The other thing that isn't as desirable as using the original whip stitch is it's not as strong because you're only working in the back loops. It's not going to give you as strong of a seam as if you're working with the whip stitch itself. However, depending on your project, this seam may work for you. The next stitch I'm going to show you how to do is the mattress stitch. Now, the last two stitches that we've done, we've worked in kind of a continuous spiral motion. With the mattress stitch, we're going to be working in more of a zigzag back and forth motion. I like to think of this stitch as either like a zipper, if you're pulling up a zipper on a sweatshirt, or if you are putting new shoelaces in your shoes, you're going to kind of be doing the same motion. I'm going to be working underneath both loops on each side for this stitch, and I'm going to start in the bottom corner once again, representing my first stitch, and I'm going to work from back to front, pulling my yarn through. I'm pulling this toward the center. So you want to think of always bringing your yarn back toward the center after you work on each side. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Instead of going from front to back like I've done before, I'm going to go from back to front and then bringing it back toward the center. And this is one of those stitches that it might be helpful once again to kind of hold your pieces together. So I'm going to work into my next double crochet stitch, which is right here. I'm going to be inserting my needle from back to front once again, and then bringing it back toward the center. In my other side, I'm going to be working from back to front again, bringing it back toward the center, back to front, back to front on the other side. So you're just kind of doing a crisscross motion here, but you're doing the same thing on both sides. And the fun part about the mattress stitch, when I said that it kind of reminds me of a zipper, is after you have reached a few stitches, you can set your work down and zip up your seam. So what I like to do is just take my yarn end and pull it like this, and then pull my other yarn end like this, and I've zipped up the seam. So I'm going to continue to work back and forth, and I'm going to show you what this stitch looks like when we reach the end. Now I've reached the top, and I'm going to pull my last set of stitches. This stitch really works best if you do a few and then pull your seam together. That way it doesn't get all bunchy and uneven at the end. When we're talking about pros and cons of each stitch, some things that I really like about the mattress stitch is it leaves a really nice sturdy seam. So when you're working back and forth in that crisscross motion, it just adds a lot of reinforcement to the seam. You can see that the seam is fairly flat. When you compare it to the other ones, it's a little bit more hidden. However, it's not 100% invisible, but if I were using gray yarn to sew these two pieces together, you probably wouldn't see it. A couple of things that you might not find as desirable is it's obviously slightly more difficult than using the whip stitch. And another thing is you do have to kind of tighten your seam after you go up a few stitches. If you wait until the end, if you're especially working with a really long piece and you try to tighten up your seam, you're going to have a lot of bunching. So it's one of the ones that you kind of have to be careful with and make sure that your seam looks good and it's nice and tight as you work. But overall, it's a really great stitch. The next stitch I'm going to show you is what I call the invisible stitch. Now, this one is probably the most complicated of all of the stitches that I'm going to show. I'm going to be working once again in the back loop only, so we're not going to be working underneath both of these loops. And just like the mattress stitch, we're going to be working back and forth in a zigzag motion. So I'm going to begin once again on my left-hand side, and I'm going to be splitting these stitches in half. So I'm going to be going in from the top of my first stitch here, which is my chain stitch at the bottom, and then up through the next stitch. And you can see that it kind of forms an X here. And I'm going to pull my yarn through. Once again, bringing it to the other side. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to find my chain stitch and my first double crochet, and I'm going to work from the top of that stitch here. So splitting that stitch in half in the back loop, and then coming back up through the next loop. Once again, you can see that little X that forms, and I'm going to be pulling that one through. So obviously you can see one of the not so great things about this stitch right away is it requires a lot more detail. So I'm going to be working back into the same stitch that I started from. I'm not going to be going into this stitch. I'm going to be doing that same motion, going back down through, and then up through the next one. Once again, you can see that little X right there. And I'm going to bring it up on this side. On the other side, you can see where I came out of on this side here. I'm going to go back down through that one and come up through the next one. Once again, back down through the back loop only, and then up the back loop only on the next side. Once again, seeing that little X there. Trying to keep my tail from getting involved in this. Here's where I came out on my other side, so I'm going to go back down through that one and then up on this side. So I'm not going to pull my tail quite yet. I'm going to do kind of like the mattress stitch. After I do a few stitches, then I'm going to pull it, because it is beneficial to see where you've worked from your previous stitch. So once again, going into the back loop only from front to back, and then splitting the next stitch in half from back to front and bringing it over. I'm going to do one more here. front to back on this stitch, and then back to front on the next one. I'm going to pull my seam so that you can see what happens here. And I'm going to continue to work back and forth until I get to the top. I've reached the top here, and I think the most satisfying part about this stitch is when you pull it and it zips shut. Going back to our pros and cons, a couple of things that I really like about this invisible stitch is that it's invisible. Another thing that I really like about it is that it leaves a very nice flat seam that's really well structured. It works great if you are putting together pieces that are not the same color. So if I had two granny squares that were not the same color and I'm seaming them together, it wouldn't matter. You wouldn't be able to see the stitches in between. A couple of things that you may not enjoy about it as much is it's obviously a lot more difficult than the other stitches that I showed you. So it takes a little bit more time to seam your pieces together. The other thing is that by working in the back loops, it is a fairly sturdy stitch, but it isn't as strong as the mattress stitch. So if you're putting together a very large piece, like a super large granny square blanket, you might find that there's a little bit of gapping that might happen over time. But if you're looking for a very clean and very seamless stitch, then this is the stitch for you. And now I've kind of zoomed out so that you can see all of these stitches in side-by-side comparison. So here, just to recap, I have the whip stitch, which was worked underneath both loops, the whip stitch here, which was worked underneath the back loops only, the mattress stitch, which was worked underneath both loops, and the invisible stitch, which was worked under the back loops only. If I had to rate each of these stitches based off of strength, this is just my personal opinion, I would probably go with the mattress stitch first. You're going back and forth in a zigzag motion and you're working underneath both loops. Next, I would probably choose the whip stitch, and that's just once again because you're going underneath both loops and you have that extra reinforcement. Then I would probably choose the invisible stitch because you're working back and forth in that zigzag motion, even though it is in the back loops. It's just providing a little bit more strength. And last, as far as strength, I would choose the whip stitch in the back loop only. It's still a really great stitch and it would be really great for lighter weight projects. As far as invisibility of each stitch, obviously I would choose the invisible stitch first, followed by the mattress stitch, the whip stitch in the back loop only, and then finally the whip stitch underneath both loops. Overall, I feel that each of these stitches have their own pros and cons, and it's kind of up to you to decide which one that you enjoy and which one is going to work best for your project. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to my channel for more crochet tutorials.